The year was 1908. The United States was in the middle of transformation. Factories were growing, trains were stretching across the land, and electricity had begun to light up the cities. But in small towns scattered across the countryside, life still moved at a slow, steady rhythm. One such town was Millfield, a quiet farming community tucked between rolling hills and winding rivers in Massachusetts. Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew one another. Families worked long hours tending fields, mending fences, or sewing clothes by candlelight. Sundays were for church, and Saturdays were for the market, where people traded eggs for flour or firewood for sugar. Amid this simple, hard-working life stood a one-room schoolhouse, humble, wooden, and painted white, with a bell that rang each morning to call the children inside. The school was not grand by any means. It had no tiled floors or polished desks. Instead, the room was warmed by a single iron stove. The desks bore years of scratches and initials carved by restless hands, and the blackboard was patched in places. Yet to the people of Millfield, this school represented something far greater than bricks or boards. It was hope. For parents who had spent their childhoods without books or lessons, the idea that their sons and daughters might read, write, and perhaps even go beyond the farm filled them with pride. But education was still not seen as a necessity for all. Many children left school by the age of 12 to help on farms or work in local workshops. Some families argued they simply couldn't afford to lose the labor of their children. Others believed learning beyond the basics of reading and arithmetic was unnecessary. Yet, there was one man in Millfield who refused to let that thinking stand unchallenged, Mr. Harrington, the headmaster. He was a stern but kind-hearted man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a voice that carried across the room without effort. He believed passionately that education was not just about reading books. It was about preparing children for a future they could not yet see. He often said, "The world is changing, and our children must be ready to change with it." Mr. Harrington worked tirelessly to keep the school alive. Each year, he fought for funds from the county, patched leaking roofs with his own hands, and purchased supplies when donations fell short. His vision was simple. Every child in Millfield deserved the chance to learn, whether they were the son of a farmer, the daughter of a blacksmith, or even the orphan who had no shoes to wear. The school itself was divided by curtains into two sections, one for younger children, who struggled through their alphabets and arithmetic tables, and another for older students, who copied passages of history and practiced penmanship by lantern light. The walls were decorated with maps, though some were outdated, and a few carefully preserved books sat proudly on a small shelf, passed down from earlier decades. Despite the limitations, the children came alive within those four walls. What made the school truly special, however, was not the building, but the spirit it carried. Each morning, children arrived with eager, if sometimes nervous, faces. Some walked several miles in the biting winter cold, their shoes thin and coats patched, yet they carried their slates and pencils with pride. For them, sitting at a desk meant stepping into a world beyond their small town. Once a year, Mr. Harrington insisted on a school photograph. It was not a common practice in towns as small as Millfield, where photography was still considered a luxury. The camera was bulky, the process expensive, and families often saved for years just to have a single portrait taken. But Harrington believed that a yearly photo of the school children was important. He wanted proof that Millfield valued learning, that the town could show to outsiders, and to themselves, that its children were being prepared for the future. On the day of the photograph, excitement buzzed through the air. Mothers scrubbed their children's faces, braided hair neatly, and brushed jackets until they looked as close to new as possible. Fathers, though tired from the fields, walked their children proudly to the schoolhouse. For that single moment, education was not just an idea, it was a celebration. Looking at the school from the outside, it was nothing extraordinary. One small wooden building on a dusty road. Yet for Millfield, it was the beating heart of the community, the place where hope gathered each day. It stood as a reminder that progress was not only measured in factories and cities, but also in the determination of a few townspeople who believed their children deserved more than the lives they themselves had lived. This was the simple school of 1908, a place that held together the dreams of a community, a place that showed even in the humblest of towns, with the simplest of tools, education had the power to transform lives. It was here, in this one-room schoolhouse, that something unusual would soon happen, something that began with an ordinary photograph, but would forever change how the people of Millfield understood the meaning of opportunity and compassion. It was the morning of October 3rd, 1908, when the town of Millfield stirred with an unusual excitement. The school bell rang at precisely 8 o'clock, its sharp clang echoing across the fields. But on this day, it wasn't just the signal for lessons to begin. It was the reminder of something special. Today was the day of the annual school photograph. Children had been whispering about it for weeks. In a time when photography was still rare and costly, the chance to be captured in a photograph was something extraordinary. Many families in Millfield had no portraits of their own. For some, the school photo would be the only image of their child ever taken. Parents often framed the prints with care, displaying them on the mantel beside family Bibles and heirlooms. The small roads leading to the schoolhouse were livelier than usual. Mothers straightened collars and smoothed down skirts, while fathers reminded their children to stand tall and look serious. The idea of smiling widely in a photograph had not yet become popular. Instead, families thought solemn expressions made portraits look more dignified. Despite their best efforts, not every child could arrive in perfect condition. Some wore patched trousers or dresses mended at the seams. Others came with scuffed shoes or none at all, their bare feet toughened by months of walking on dirt paths. Yet on this day, those details seemed less important. What mattered most was that every child would be part of something memorable, part of a visual legacy for the town. Inside the one-room school, Headmaster Harrington moved about with an energy that belied his age. He opened the tall windows to let in fresh autumn air, then carefully positioned the benches so that every child would fit into the frame. The iron stove was quiet for now, its fire unlit, so no smoke would cloud the photograph. On the blackboard, the headmaster had written neatly in chalk, "Millfield School, 1908. The younger children giggled as they tried to sit still, their little hands clutching slates or books as props. The older ones rolled their eyes but secretly felt proud. They knew these photos would one day be looked back on with reverence. At last a horse-drawn cart approached, carrying a large black case and a man in a bowler hat. This was Mr. Duval, the traveling photographer who visited Millfield once or twice a year. His equipment was bulky and delicate, consisting of a wooden tripod and a large box-shaped camera with a heavy lens. He also carried glass plates and chemical solutions for developing the image. The process required patience. Children who couldn't sit still often ended up as blurs on the final print. Mr. Duval entered the schoolhouse with an air of professionalism. "Good morning, scholars," he said, adjusting his hat. The children straightened immediately, their chatter fading into whispers. He spent several minutes setting up his camera, adjusting its height, and pulling a dark cloth over his head as he tested the frame. "Tall ones at the back, small ones in front," Mr. Harrington commanded, his voice firm but encouraging. He guided the students into neat rows, occasionally tapping a shoulder or lifting a chin to correct posture. The children obeyed, though a few fidgeted nervously. The youngest, barely 6 years old, clutched their readers with both hands, while the older boys tried to look serious and important. Parents who had lingered outside peeked through the windows, anxious to see the moment their children became part of history. For them, this wasn't just a picture. It was a symbol that their town, though small and modest, believed in the value of learning. When at last everyone was in place, Mr. Duval stood behind his camera. He lifted his hand and called out, "Now hold steady, don't move." The children froze, eyes locked forward, lips pressed tightly together. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the rustle of skirts. Then came the flash. A sudden burst of light filled the room as the magnesium powder burned bright and smoky. Several children gasped, while others blinked furiously, but the deed was done, the moment was captured. For most of the students, it seemed like any other photo, ordinary and unremarkable. They straightened their clothes. whispered to their friends, and wondered if they had managed to look proper enough. None of them could have guessed that this particular photograph would soon reveal something extraordinary, something that would change the way their town thought about education and compassion. As the photographer carefully packed away his equipment, the children spilled outside into the crisp autumn air. They ran and played, shaking off the stiffness of posing, while parents thanked Mr. Harrington and Mr. Duval for the occasion. Some families would not see the final image for several weeks, as the glass plates needed time to be developed and printed. Still, there was a shared excitement. Mr. Harrington, standing by the doorway, looked out over his students with quiet pride. To others, they were just children from a small farming town. But to him, they were the future, each one holding a spark of potential that could light up a changing world. Later, when the photograph was developed, parents and teachers would gather eagerly around the print, pointing out familiar faces. At first glance, it would seem perfectly normal rows of children, the proud headmaster in the center, books and slates held neatly in hand. But there, at the very back of the room, something unusual would be noticed. A figure no one remembered, a face no one could place. For now, though, that mystery remained hidden in the glass plate, waiting quietly to be revealed. On this day, the town celebrated not a ghostly presence, but the triumph of capturing their children's youth, their pride in schooling, and their unity as a community that valued knowledge, even in the simplest of settings. When the school photograph of Millfield was finally developed weeks later, excitement swept through the small town. Parents gathered in the headmaster's office, eager to see the image of their children, neatly arranged in rows inside the one-room schoolhouse. It was not just a picture, it was a piece of history, a memory they could hold in their hands. At first glance, the photograph looked exactly as expected. The children were lined up in their best clothes, their faces serious, their postures stiff but proud. Mr. Harrington, the headmaster, stood in the center, his hand resting firmly on the back of a chair, his expression dignified. Behind him, the chalkboard bore the carefully written words, Millfield School 1908. But then, as eyes scanned the image more carefully, a murmur began to ripple through the room. Someone leaned closer, pointing toward the far corner near the tall shelves. "Who's that?" a mother asked, her voice uncertain. At the very back of the room, barely noticeable unless one looked carefully, was the faint but undeniable figure of a young girl. She was standing slightly apart from the others, half shadowed by the shelves. Unlike the other children, she did not hold a book or slate, nor did she wear clean Sunday clothes. Her dress looked plain and frayed, her hair untidy, and most striking of all, her feet were bare. The townspeople leaned in closer, confusion spreading quickly. "That's not my daughter," one woman said. "She doesn't belong to any of the families here," added another. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while a few whispered nervously of superstitions. In rural towns like Millfield, ghost stories often circulated, tales of lost souls wandering through old buildings. The girl's solemn, unsmiling face only added to the mystery. Her dark eyes seemed to look directly into the lens, as though she had been waiting for this moment. The children, too, noticed her when the photograph was shown to them. "I didn't see her there that day," one boy insisted. "She wasn't standing with us," another chimed in. "I think she slipped in after the photo started." But Mr. Harrington, the headmaster, frowned deeply. He was not one for ghostly tales. He believed there was a more earthly explanation, and he was determined to uncover it. It did not take long for the truth to emerge. Several students admitted that, on many mornings, they had seen a young girl lingering near the windows of the schoolhouse. She never came inside, but often stood outside in the cold, her face pressed against the glass as she tried to listen to the lessons. "She writes on scraps of paper," one of the older girls explained. "I saw her copying the words we say out loud." The girl's name, they learned, was Clara Whitfield. She was about 10 years old, the daughter of a factory worker who had died in an accident earlier that year. Clara's mother, left widowed and destitute, worked long hours in a textile mill, leaving the child to her own devices. Too poor to buy proper clothes or pay for school fees, Clara had no choice but to stay outside. Yet her hunger for knowledge was so strong that she lingered at the windows day after day, silently absorbing whatever she could. On the day of the photograph, Clara had slipped inside when no one noticed. She positioned herself quietly at the back of the room, hidden in the shadows, desperate to be part of what she had only observed from a distance for so long. The discovery shook the townspeople. At first, some parents were uneasy. "She doesn't belong in the picture," one father grumbled. "She isn't even a student here." Others feared that allowing such children inside would set a precedent, that soon the school would be filled with every orphan or poor child wandering the county. But as they looked again at Clara's face in the photograph, something shifted. There was no mischief in her eyes, no intention to deceive. There was only longing, an unspoken plea to be included, to learn, to belong. For many, it stirred uncomfortable truths. They remembered their own childhoods without books, their own struggles to read or write simple letters. They thought about the opportunities their children now had and realized how cruel it was to deny another child the same chance simply because of poverty. The headmaster wasted no time. The following Monday, Clara was invited formally into the classroom. She entered barefoot, shy, clutching a bundle of worn papers filled with scribbles and half-formed letters. The other children fell silent as she walked in, but Mr. Harrington greeted her warmly. "This girl," he told the class, "has worked harder than most of you, learning without books, without teachers, without a desk to sit at. She has more determination than many who take their education for granted. From this day forward, she is a student of Millfield School." It was a bold decision, one that not everyone supported at first, but gradually resistance melted away. Mothers began bringing extra bread or old dresses for Clara. Fathers donated scraps of wood so that a proper desk could be built for her. The children, too, began to admire her quiet resilience, often sharing their books or pencils when she had none. The photograph that had caused confusion and whispers soon became a symbol of something greater. What had seemed like an accident, or to some a haunting, turned into a reminder of compassion and inclusion. Clara's presence in that photo was no mistake. It was a moment of truth captured forever. When visitors came to the school, Mr. Harrington proudly showed them the picture. "Look carefully," he would say. "Do you see that girl at the back? She reminds us that no child should have to stand outside the window to learn. Education belongs to all." From that year onward, Millfield became known as a town that opened its doors wider. Other poor children, once too shy or too impoverished to join, were welcomed into the classroom. The photograph had awakened something in the hearts of the community, a recognition that a school was not just for the privileged, but for every child who hungered for knowledge. Clara's silent figure, once strange and mysterious, had become the spark of change. She was no longer a shadow in the background. She was the reminder that sometimes the unnoticed presence among us carries the greatest message. For weeks after the school photograph was developed, the town of Millfield buzzed with speculation. The image of the barefoot girl standing quietly at the back of the classroom had unsettled many. Some said she was a spirit, a ghost caught between worlds. Others argued she must have wandered in by mistake. Children whispered about her at night, inventing stories of a mysterious stranger who had appeared only for the photograph. But the truth was far less mystical and far more powerful. Headmaster Harrington was not one to let rumors run wild. Practical to his core, he began making quiet inquiries. He asked the children if they had seen the girl before. A few nodded nervously. One said, "I saw her outside once near the window." Another added, "She was writing something on scraps of paper." That was enough for Harrington to act. He set out one chilly morning to walk the town, asking around until he found someone who knew her. Soon, he was led to a narrow alley behind the textile mill, where in a small, drafty room lived a widow named Mrs. Whitfield and her daughter Clara. When Harrington knocked, Clara herself opened the door. She looked smaller up close than she had in the photo, thin from lack of food, her hair tied back in a simple knot. Her eyes widened with fear, as though she expected scolding or punishment. But Harrington only smiled gently and said, "You were in our school photograph. Now I want to hear your story." Clara's mother, weary from endless shifts at the mill, explained between tired breaths. Her husband had been killed in a machinery accident earlier that year, leaving her to care for Clara alone. With little money, she could not afford the clothing, books, or fees that school required. Clara spent her days at home or wandering near the schoolhouse, too shy to step inside but too eager to stay away. "I wanted to learn," Clara admitted softly, twisting her hands together. "So I listened from the windows. I copied what I heard on scraps of paper. I didn't mean to cause trouble. On picture day, I wanted to belong." Her honesty silenced the room. The headmaster, a man who had seen children come and go for decades, felt a lump in his throat. Here was a girl who had no shoes, no books, no official place in the classroom, yet she had the strongest desire to learn of any child he had ever met. News of Clara's story spread quickly. At first, it stirred uncomfortable feelings. Some parents whispered, "If we allow one poor child in, where will it end?" Others pitied her but believed charity was best left to the church, not the school. But then they looked again at the photograph. They saw Clara's face, her eyes focused not on the other children but on the camera, as if she were looking through it into the future. There was no shame in her expression, only determination. Slowly, pity turned into admiration. People began to realize that Clara's courage, to slip inside, to stand among them though she had nothing, was something worth honoring, not hiding. The following Monday, Mr. Harrington addressed the school. Clara sat nervously at the back, clutching her scraps of paper. The other children stared, whispering. Some were curious, others skeptical. Harrington raised his hand for silence. "This young girl," he said, gesturing toward Clara, "has studied harder than any of you. She has stood outside our windows in the cold, without shoes on her feet, and learned what she could without books or teachers. She has shown us all what the hunger for knowledge truly looks like. From this day forward, Clara Whitfield is a student of Millfield School." The room fell into a stunned hush. Then, slowly, a few children clapped. Others followed. By the end, nearly every hand in the room was applauding, while Clara sat red-faced, blinking back tears. Clara's acceptance marked a turning point for Millfield. At first, she came with little more than the clothes on her back and her treasured scraps of paper. But the community soon rallied around her. A local seamstress brought her an old dress, carefully mended. A farmer's wife donated sturdy boots from her daughter who had outgrown them. A blacksmith carved her a slate board, while other families shared pencils and ink. What had begun as suspicion turned into collective pride. The townspeople realized that education was not a privilege reserved for the comfortable. It was a right, and Clara's determination reminded them of that truth. Within months, Clara flourished. She caught up quickly with her classmates, her sharp memory serving her well after months of listening outside. Teachers marveled at her eagerness, her careful handwriting, and her thoughtful questions. She stayed after class, asking for extra lessons, and borrowed books whenever she could. For the other children, Clara became a quiet source of inspiration. They saw her studying diligently while they sometimes groaned over assignments. Her presence made them realize how fortunate they were to have desks, books, and shoes. In her quiet way, Clara raised the standards of the entire classroom. Years later, the photograph that had started it all remained proudly displayed in the schoolhouse. Parents would point to it when visitors came. "See that girl in the back? That's Clara. She taught us all what education means." The photograph no longer seemed ordinary. It had captured a moment of truth, an invisible child stepping into the light, her presence forcing a town to reckon with its values. Clara herself would go on to become a teacher, dedicating her life to ensuring that no child would ever again be left outside the window. But in Millfield, she was remembered not only for what she became, but for the way she had entered their story, a barefoot girl in the back of a photograph, reminding them that the pursuit of knowledge can never be silenced by poverty. When Clara Whitfield officially joined the Millfield schoolhouse, it did more than give a single child a desk and a slate. It stirred something deep in the hearts of the townspeople. What had started as whispers of suspicion and pity soon grew into a collective realization education could no longer be a privilege reserved for those with means. It was a right, and it was the foundation for a better future. At first, Clara's presence was met with mixed emotions. Some children were fascinated by her, whispering questions behind cupped hands. Is she really as smart as they say? Others, influenced by their parents, treated her with hesitation. Poverty carried a stigma in 1908. Bare feet and patched dresses were silent markers of hardship, and not everyone was ready to erase the invisible lines that divided the town. But day by day, Clara's behavior dissolved doubts. She arrived early, often sweeping the floor before lessons began. She listened intently, answered questions thoughtfully, and never once complained about what she lacked. When she borrowed a book, she handled it as though it were treasure, turning each page carefully, her eyes alight with wonder. The other students began to notice. Some who had grumbled about arithmetic started to feel embarrassed when Clara asked for extra problems to solve. Those who had once hidden their books at home now found themselves proud to share them with her. Slowly, admiration replaced hesitation. The adults of Millfield, too, found themselves moved. The seamstress who had given Clara a mended dress began sewing small ribbons for her hair. The blacksmith's wife brought bread wrapped in cloth, quietly slipping it into Clara's hands after school. Even the farmers, hardened by years of toil, began sending eggs or potatoes for her mother, ensuring the family would not go hungry. It was not charity born of pity, it was respect. Clara had earned her place, and in doing so, she reminded everyone of their shared responsibility. One Sunday, during the church gathering, Reverend Matthews addressed the congregation. Children are the seeds of tomorrow. If we neglect even one, we starve the harvest of our future. Clara has shown us that hunger for knowledge is as vital as hunger for bread. Let us feed both. His words struck a chord. From that day, families who had once hesitated began contributing in whatever way they could. Clara's story also forced parents to rethink the role of education in their children's lives. Before, many saw schooling as secondary to farm labor or household duties. But seeing Clara barefoot, fatherless, with every reason to give up, show more eagerness than some of their own children, parents began to reconsider. Fathers who once pulled sons from class during harvest season started allowing them to stay longer. Mothers who believed girls only needed to know cooking and sewing began insisting their daughters learn history and arithmetic too. Education was no longer viewed as optional. It was becoming essential. The school itself began to transform. Donations trickled in, not just for Clara, but for all the children. Old maps were replaced, new slates were purchased, and even a small collection of books grew on the shelf. The schoolhouse, once a modest room with peeling paint and creaking floors, began to look like a place of genuine opportunity. What made the transformation remarkable was that Clara never sought to be a symbol. She had no grand speeches, no lofty demands. Her presence was quiet, her actions simple. Yet in that simplicity lay her power. She reminded Millfield of what they already knew deep down, that education was about more than letters on a page. It was about dignity, hope, and the chance for a better life. Children began to look at her differently. Clara studies harder than any of us. One boy admitted, "If she can do it, what excuse do I have?" Her determination raised the standards of the entire classroom. Competition became healthy, and pride in learning grew. Months later, when the photograph was shown again, its meaning had shifted. No longer did parents whisper about the strange barefoot girl at the back. Instead, they pointed her out proudly. "There she is," they told visitors. "That's Clara, the girl who reminded us what schooling is for." The photograph became more than a yearly tradition. It became a symbol of Millfield's awakening. It hung not only in the schoolhouse but in the church hall, reminding everyone that one small act of courage, stepping into a room where she didn't seem to belong, had reshaped the town's values. What began with a single child spread outward. Other families who had kept children at home because of poverty now found the courage to send them to school. With Clara as proof, no one dared say, "They don't belong here." Instead, townspeople worked together to ensure no child would stand outside the windows again. Millfield became known in neighboring towns for its generosity and vision. Teachers from other areas visited to learn how one rural community had turned adversity into opportunity. The ripple effect was real. Clara's presence awakened not just her town, but an entire region's conversation about access to education. The awakening of Millfield was not about charity alone. It was about transformation. Clara's courage had forced the town to look inward, to examine whether they truly believed in fairness, compassion, and the future of their children. By choosing to embrace her, they embraced the best version of themselves. The lesson was simple yet profound. Communities do not rise when they protect privilege, they rise when they lift the most vulnerable among them. Clara continued to learn, thrive, and inspire, but the greater story was what happened around her. Millfield was no longer just a farming town with a modest schoolhouse. It became a place where children of all backgrounds studied side by side, where compassion replaced division, and where hope for the future grew stronger with each lesson. That was the true awakening, the realization that education could unite, uplift, and transform not only one child's life, but the destiny of an entire community. The photograph of 1908 had begun as a simple tradition, an annual record of Millfield's school children. But by the time its story unfolded, it had become much more than an image. It was a turning point, a silent testimony that one child's determination could awaken an entire community. And its influence did not end with that year. Clara Whitfield's presence in the back of the room echoed across decades, shaping lives long after the moment was captured on glass. Once welcomed into the school, Clara threw herself into learning with unmatched intensity. Her hunger for knowledge, sharpened by months of listening at the windows, made her a quick learner. Within 2 years, she had not only caught up to her classmates, but often surpassed them. Her essays reflected thoughtfulness, her arithmetic was precise, and her penmanship grew elegant and strong. When other children groaned at lessons, Clara's eyes lit up. She saw every problem as a challenge, every book as an opportunity, and every word as a key to the wider world. Teachers often remarked that Clara did not simply study. She devoured knowledge. Her progress inspired her peers. Some began to stay after school with her, eager to match her dedication. Study groups formed, driven by her quiet determination. Clara, without intending to, raised the bar for what learning could mean in Millfield. But Clara's legacy was not confined to the classroom. Her story spread through the community, and over time, it became woven into the town's identity. Families who once doubted the value of schooling now pointed to Clara as proof of what education could accomplish. The annual photograph became a bigger event than ever before. Parents dressed their children carefully, not only to capture a likeness, but to honor the tradition that had brought Clara into their midst. In later years, Clara herself appeared in those photos, no longer the hidden figure at the back, but proudly seated among her classmates, dressed neatly thanks to the generosity of the town. Other poor or orphaned children, who might once have been left behind, were given places in the classroom. Millfield School became known as a place of welcome, where no child was turned away. Visitors from nearby towns began to ask, how did Millfield do it? How did they make education available to all? The answer was always the same: a barefoot girl in a photograph reminded us who we were meant to be. As Clara grew, so did her ambitions. She dreamed not only of learning but of sharing knowledge with others. After completing her own studies, she went on to train as a teacher, a rare achievement for a girl of her background in the early 20th century. When she returned to Millfield years later, it was not as the child who had once stood in the shadows, but as a teacher standing proudly at the front of the classroom. For her, the journey had come full circle. She taught with the same passion she had once carried as a student, pouring her energy into every lesson, determined that no child would ever feel the exclusion she once endured. Her students adored her. She had a gift for recognizing the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the children who sat silently at the back of the room. She would gently draw them into the light, reminding them that they, too, belonged. The famous 1908 photograph remained preserved, first in the schoolhouse, then in the town's library as the years passed. Visitors often paused in front of it, intrigued by the story behind the image. To the casual eye, it looked like a simple class portrait, but to the people of Millfield, it was a symbol of transformation. Generations of students grew up hearing the story, how one poor, barefoot girl had slipped into the picture, how her courage had sparked a movement of compassion, and how she went on to dedicate her life to teaching. Parents told their children, "Never forget Clara. She showed us that everyone deserves a chance to learn." The legacy of that single photograph extended far beyond Clara's own life. Millfield became known as a town where education was sacred. By the 1920s, it had expanded its small one-room schoolhouse into a larger building to accommodate more students. By the 1940s, it was sending young men and women to colleges and universities, something once thought impossible for such a humble farming town. Each success was traced back, in part, to Clara's story. She had reminded the community that progress depended not on wealth or privilege but on the courage to include the forgotten. Even decades later, when the world had changed and new technologies filled classrooms, the story of Clara Whitfield was still told. Teachers recounted it to restless students who complained about homework, reminding them, "There was once a girl who had nothing, not shoes, not books, not even permission to enter a classroom. Yet she fought to learn. If she could value education so highly, so can you." The story motivated children to study harder, parents to support schooling more fully, and communities to see education as a shared responsibility. Clara's presence in that photograph had lit a torch that would never be extinguished. Clara eventually passed away in her later years, having spent her life teaching in small towns across Massachusetts. At her funeral, former students filled the church, many standing outside because there was no room within. Some were doctors, some teachers, some farmers, some mothers and fathers, but all carried the imprint of her influence. At the front of the church, beside her coffin, stood the framed 1908 photograph. It was more than a picture now, it was her legacy, the moment that had changed her life and the lives of countless others. The town of Millfield never forgot the lesson that one child had taught them, that education belongs to all, and when a community chooses inclusion over exclusion, it builds not just a better school but a stronger, more compassionate future. That was the legacy that lasted, not just Clara's, but the legacy of a community awakened by a single act of courage.